Hi, welcome to everybody who's coming. If you're hearing me right now, you're a couple of minutes early, so welcome. This is day 3, our 5th of 6 sessions in this policy convention of California Association of Nonprofits. I'm Jan Masaoka from CalNonprofits, and I want to welcome everybody to this very interesting topic today, which is titled Every Nonprofit is a Climate Nonprofit. And I think that I'm looking forward to learning stuff on this. So I also want to thank our sponsors that made it possible for us to offer this at such a reasonable price. Our gold level sponsors, Jitasa, which is back office accounting, and ROCOM, which is nonprofit workforce recruiting, And our other sponsors, Durfee Foundation, Adler and Colvin, a preeminent law firm for around nonprofit issues in California, Fearless Advocacy. Fearless is principal is our moderator today, Jennifer Fearing. The National Housing Law Project, whose executive director is also a panelist today. Key Writing Concepts, which is a grant writing firm. Campbell Taylor Washburn, Pearl Diving LLC, a consulting firm, and our subsidiary, CalNonprofits Insurance Services. So I want to thank all of our sponsors. And I'm going to let Jennifer introduce her panel, but before that, I just want to say a word or two about that. Jennifer is the principal of Fearless Advocacy, which is a very successful and high-profile lobby firm in Sacramento. And I am very proud to say that Fearless Advocacy is our advocate, our Sacramento advocate too, for the California Association of Nonprofits. And she is truly fearless and daring and smart in pursuit of everything good, and an inspiration to me personally. She's especially known for speaking the truth about racial justice, about economic justice, about animal welfare, about women, about conservation and environment, and of course about climate. And just one thing that you should know about her as Thanksgiving nears, is that one of the many things that she does is that she organizes the donation of vegan turkeys for food banks, so that people who are vegan and making use of those kinds of resources are able to do that. And to me, that's just an example of how she doesn't stop with what the work says it is. She continues on, and she's an overachiever, let's just say that, in almost everything she does. So thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today as the moderator. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Jan. Any panel that opens with a nod to vegan turkeys is a panel I can get excited about. So thank you and good morning to everybody here. I'm so excited about this conversation, but I confess that I am daunted, right, at the existential threat that climate change poses for all of us alive on planet Earth right now. If you listened to your local NPR affiliate at all during the past few weeks or read your local newspaper, #support local journalism, you're undoubtedly aware that national and subnational and nonprofit and youth leaders have just returned to their homes around the world after convening in Glasgow, Scotland, where they attempted to reach agreements around commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to mitigate climate change impacts, to adapt to its unavoidable consequences, and to transfer resources needed for coping with climate change from wealthier, responsible industrial nations to lesser developed countries, primarily in the global South, which is on track to suffer the most as climate conditions worsen. Many nonprofits, many of whom that I work with, work directly in this lane. Climate action organizations, environmental protection and conservation groups, environmental justice and health nonprofits, but all of us are contending and will increasingly contend with the adverse consequences of climate change. And all of us make decisions as individuals and organizations that have their own climate change implications. So today's panel is ambitiously trying to meet us all where we are and to have a frank conversation about what climate change is, how it is impacting California and Californians, what dealing with this crisis will mean for the nonprofit sector writ large, how it is affecting and will affect community needs and services, and how it could exacerbate longstanding inequities and pollution burdens. And finally, what policies and practices and investments need to be considered now and in the future. In the interest of time, I'm just going to share brief descriptions of each of our esteemed panelists. You can read their full bios on the convention website. And then I'm going to provide a quick kind of climate change 101 to ensure that we are all starting with the same foundational information. And then we'll move to, I will pepper these very thoughtful leaders with questions that we will really hope will draw out their considerable experience and wisdom to leave you all with a sense of what's coming, what your community will need, what advocacy you should be doing, and what changes you can make within your own organization to meet the demands of this crisis. So let me tell you about who's with me today for this conversation. Lauren Sanchez is Senior Advisor for Climate to Governor Gavin Newsom. Earlier this year, she worked with the Biden administration as a climate advisor to John Kerry, and she's previously served in leadership roles with the California Environmental Protection Agency and the California Air Resources Board. Shamus Roller leads the National Housing Law Project, advancing housing justice for poor people and communities. I first met Shamus years ago in Sacramento when he served as Executive Director of Housing California and as Executive Director of the Sacramento Housing Alliance. He is our immediate past chair of the CalNonprofits Board of Directors. Veronica Garibay Gonzalez co-founded and co-leads the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, on whose board of directors I am deeply privileged to serve. Veronica and Leadership Council unite climate and environmental issues with economic issues and work to co-power community voices in the San Joaquin and Eastern Coachella Valleys. Prior to her work with Leadership Council, Veronica served as the first community worker for California Rural Legal Assistance Community Equity Initiative, and her leadership was recently recognized by the Irvine Foundation. And finally, Catrice Lee is the Senior Director of Development and Grants at the San Diego Natural History Museum. She's been a nonprofit fundraiser for nearly 20 years, securing funding from government agencies and private foundations for scientific research and public engagement related to biodiversity conservation. And I get to work with Catrice in her roles as a member of the board of directors of the California Association of Museums and co-chair of their government relations committee. So everybody, please give a warm virtual welcome to these great panelists. And now Lauren and I are just going to spend like 10 minutes, predominantly me, Lauren, you left the heavy lifting of explaining climate change to me. We just want to level set for all of us so that we're all working from the same frame and not making assumptions about what folks who don't work day in and day out addressing the climate crisis know what there is to know. So if the slides could queue up. So on Monday morning, as I was making coffee in my kitchen, I heard a story about a group of small town mayors who had just returned from the Glasgow Climate Conference. And this remark by a Greenville, Mississippi mayor really struck me as capturing the entire point of today's panel. Because folks recognize that something is happening to them, but it's really good for us all to have some basic knowledge about why it's happening and what we can expect. Next slide. This is a color bar showing the annual deviation in land and ocean temperatures from the average temperature since 1850. I'm no scientist, but it's clearly indisputable from this picture that the world is getting warmer and at an unprecedented rate. Next slide. Climate is defined as the average weather in a place over many years, and climate change is a shift in those average conditions. The rapid climate change that we are now seeing is caused by humans using oil, gas, and coal for their homes, factories, and transportation. And when these fossil fuels burn, they release greenhouse gases, mostly carbon dioxide or CO2. These gases trap the sun's heat and cause the planet's temperature to rise. And as this chart shows, climate scientists often speak of Celsius degree changes because the rest of the world is on that system. But I'm going to speak in Fahrenheit since most of us on this call today live in America and we are trying to communicate clearly. The world is now about 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was in the 19th century, and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has risen by 50%. Temperature rises must slow down if we want to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, as the scientists tell us that global warming needs to be kept to 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. But unless further action is taken, the planet is on track to warm considerably to a considerably higher degree. And if nothing is done, scientists think global warming could exceed 8 degrees Fahrenheit in the future, leading to devastating heat waves, millions losing their homes to rising sea levels, and irreversible loss of plant and animal species. Next slide. Earlier this year, the international alarm bell was sounded again when the latest UN report was released, prompting the Secretary General to sound a code red for humanity. And medical leaders across the globe called the warming climate the greatest threat to global public health. Next slide. And as Californians, It's already been proven to us, sadly, how real climate change is here. And we all are grappling with the fact that climate change is a driver of change rather than a single thing. Climate change will continue to drive future environmental conditions affecting most, if not all, communities and sectors. Next slide. What are those impacts exactly? Let's walk through them briefly. Next slide. Extreme heat. Californians already experience the worst air quality in the nation. Hotter temperatures lead to more smog, which can damage lungs, increase childhood asthma, respiratory and heart disease, and death. Certain segments of our population are at greater risk, including the elderly, infants, persons with chronic heart or lung disease, people who can't afford air conditioning, and those who work outside. California has more than 1 million people that are especially vulnerable to extreme heat. As temperatures rise, the number of days of extreme heat events will also rise, causing increases in the risk of injury or death from dehydration, heat stroke, heart attack, or respiratory problems. Next slide. Drought. The Sierra Nevada snowpack functions as the most important natural reservoir of water in California. In recent history, the snowpack is created in fall and winter and slowly releases 15 million acre-feet of water during the spring and summer when we need it most. California's dams and water storage facilities are built to handle that snow melt as it has happened in the past. But more recently, less precipitation is falling in the Sierras and higher temperatures are causing the snowpack to melt earlier and all at once. These earlier and larger releases of water have the potential to overwhelm California's water storage facilities, like we saw with the Oroville Dam in 2017, heightening the risk of floods followed by water shortages. California's last major extended drought in the mid-teens cost $2.7 billion and 20,000 agricultural jobs in California. Next slide. Fire. Forest and rangelands cover over 80% of California's 100 million acres. Climate change is affecting tree survival and growth, reducing these lands' productivity and changing their habitats. In addition, as we have seen up close, climate change makes forests more vulnerable to fires by increasing temperatures and making forests and brush drier. And today's fire season starts earlier, lasts longer, and is more intense than in the last several decades. Wildfire occurrence statewide could increase several-fold by the end of the century, increasing fire suppression and emergency response costs and damage to property, and the need to invest major resources, both public and private, in so-called hardening and prevention efforts. Fall fire weather days have doubled since 1980 in California. Crazy. Next slide. Habitat destruction and loss of ecosystems. California, as you likely know, is one of the most biologically diverse regions of the world, with the highest number of unique plant and animal species of all 50 states and the greatest number of endangered species. Climate change is adversely affecting plant and wildlife habitats and the ability of the state's ecosystems to support our clean water, wildlife, fish, timber, and other goods and services important for our well-being. Next slide. And finally, if I haven't worried you enough, if you're among the approximately 85% of Californians who live and work in coastal counties, you can add a rising sea to your list of climate concerns. The sea level along California's coast has already risen 8 inches in the past century and is projected to rise by as much as 20 to 55 inches by the end of the century. To contextualize that, a 55-inch sea level rise could displace 500,000 people who are at risk of flooding by 2100 and threaten $150 billion in property and infrastructure. Think roadways, buildings, hazardous waste sites, power plants, parks, and tourist destinations. Coastal erosion can have a significant impact on California's ocean-dependent economy, estimated at around $50 billion a year. And as sea levels rise, saltwater contamination of the state's delta and levee system will increase, threatening wildlife and the source of drinking water for 20 million Californians. Next slide. Finally, reduced agricultural yields. The drought, higher temperatures, saltwater contamination, flooding, and increased risk of pests combine to pose a very serious threat to California's agricultural industry, which is responsible for more than half of all domestic fruits and vegetables. Because California feeds not only our own residents, but the entire United States and other countries as well, our production declines could lead to food shortages and higher prices. Next slide. These are the direct impacts that I've just walked through, but clearly in addition to those, we will see an acceleration and already are cascading impacts, exacerbating existing inequities and jeopardizing the lives of vulnerable people. And of course, there's the opportunity cost, right, of having to throw significant private and public funding and effort at all of these impacts will mean less funding available for other priorities. Next slide. What's really important writ large, but certainly for our sector, is a degree to which climate change impacts will fall disproportionately on underserved communities who are least able to prepare for, recover from, like these heat waves, poor air quality, flooding, and other impacts. This underscores the urgency of equitable action on climate change and the deep engagement of everyone in the nonprofit sector. Next slide. Lauren, you asked me to include this chart, so I'd love if you would speak briefly to what it says to you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And thank you again for having me and for convening this panel. I mostly wanted to share this slide in the context of kind of the rising public consciousness around climate change, and also the sense of all of our communities across California that climate change is already impacting them, and that they're acutely aware. This number isn't included on this slide, but 90% of Californians connect the wildfires and drought and many of the impacts, Jennifer, that you've outlined in previous slides to climate change. So just, I think although industry has spent trillions of dollars on a misinformation campaign, a lot of public support and public awareness and public concern around this issue.
Thank you. How about moving to the next slide? Just wanted to share a couple other marks of what you just described, Lauren. The Public Policy Institute of California, as you know, they check in with Californians every summer on their attitudes and concerns about different environmental health issues. And you can see from this latest poll that 2/3 of Californians are aware that climate change has already begun, but you can also see a disconnect among income and racial lines about the burden of air pollution in lower income areas. Next slide. Californians are all pretty worried about wildfires and the availability of water in their areas. So what we have is a public that broadly accepts that the impacts of climate change are real, that is actively experiencing those effects, but it is not yet aligned about the underlying inequity of that experience, rooted as it is in the disproportionate burdens of pollution, health outcomes, income inequality, and other vulnerabilities that our sector is always working to address. So hopefully this foundational panel has been helpful and sets the frame for our panel discussion, which we will turn to next. So if we could bring up the panelists and set down the slides. I want to kick it off. Lauren, since you're already visible, we're going to start with you. Thank you so much for joining us and for your service to the state of California. Lauren, in your role, you're tasked with helping to anticipate and then coordinate the state's climate change policy. And that runs the gamut from efforts to reduce emissions, implement a just transition to clean energy, protect vulnerable communities from the health impacts of localized pollution, protect all Californians from these climate perils and risks, investing in hardening and resiliency, and responding to the climate emergencies. I don't know how you do it, but maybe you could give us some insights into how you think about the intersectionality of all of this and the role of the whole of government in terms of driving investments, policies, and responses.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jennifer. And thank you again for convening this panel. I'm really thrilled to be here and mostly to learn from my fellow panelists and other folks joining us today virtually. Jennifer, the short answer to your question is if I weren't taking an intersectional approach to this job, I would be failing Californians. As you just articulately laid out, we do know that climate is impacting every aspect of Californians' lives and their well-being. From record-breaking heat waves to life-threatening fires, we know that climate emergencies are growing and intensifying, growing in frequency, and that, as you laid out, they disproportionately impact our communities of color and our low-income Californians. And I guess I just want to take a moment as someone who's been working in the climate movement for my entire career. 20 years ago, this movement really used to be about saving the polar bear. And now we know that the crisis isn't about 2050 or 2100. It's for Californians about 2021 and 2022. And we know that the crisis is impacting the health and well-being of our communities from, harmful wildfire smoke. Every Californian breathed unhealthy air at some period of our 2020 wildfire season, to the growing consciousness around the mental and behavioral health issues that Californians are facing around climate anxiety and climate despair. So how do I, in this role, think about making climate an all of government or all of society effort? I think there's a lot of rhetoric around this in recent years, but actually implementing it is a very fun part of my job, especially because I think most Californians think of state government as a clunky bureaucracy, a monolith in Sacramento that's pretty far away from a lot of our communities. When I came into this job in August, I think I mostly started by reflecting on what I had learned or observed from watching COVID and how communities responded and communities were impacted, and then the racial justice movement that impacted here in California, but across the nation over the last year and a half. And the kind of number one takeaway from both of those was that our climate solutions must be built around community and put people in the center. I think often our climate agenda, dating back to 2006 and AB 32 was defined by kind of policy wonks, myself included. Very guilty of this in past lives. And we were really focused on decarbonizing or squeezing pollution out of society instead of really visualizing and defining and moving towards what our climate safe reality could look like, what our future here in California in 2030 could mean for communities, and the economic and social opportunity that tackling this agenda can really deliver for Californians. The governor a few weeks ago, when in Wilmington, kind of unveiling our latest climate action, said, our quest now in the next year is to think about how climate justice can really deliver economic and social justice. We know that Californians are suffering from the climate crisis, but they're also suffering from the housing crisis and affordability crisis and income inequality crisis. And we know that we have a number of tools at the state's disposal and in partnership with the feds where we can really tackle some, economic and social disparities while advancing our climate agenda, cleaning up the air, cleaning up water for too many communities who, haven't had the luxury of having that in our state for many decades. So I do think that engaging communities and empowering Californians to be a part of driving this change will be critical to our success. Of course, that's where our nonprofit community comes in, because we can only ask our communities to engage on so many issues. And because climate is a healthcare issue, it's a water issue, an ag issue, nonprofit and the advocacy community really giving voice to communities through state government and all of our processes, from the budget to different regulations, working together with local governments around permitting and land use, incredibly important partnerships. I think another component of intersectionality, Jennifer, is really about crafting an agenda that the governor can illustrate that has a role for everyone. This isn't just an environmental issue. There is a role for educators and financial risk assessors and farmers and tribal leaders and labor leaders. The all of society movement means working in close partnership with different factions of society and helping to empower them to have a role in our movement as well. I also just want to kind of briefly note, we know the tremendous amount of economic opportunity in shifting away from fossil fuels. Your slides did such a great job of pointing out kind of what's at stake. But I think we don't, especially the state, do enough in kind of communicating around the enormous wealth and opportunity that can be created from moving to our climate safe future. And we know that for too long, we've created this false trade-off between community and people's jobs and their economic opportunity, or the environment and their health. And so I think, moving forward, there are, at a minimum, communities need to experience the benefits of moving away from fossil fuels and all of the jobs and opportunity that will be created. But we know that communities that have suffered disproportionately should be at the core of those solutions and the benefits. Just kind of tactically, I chair the climate cabinet, which includes kind of 10 agency heads from all over state government. For those of you that interact with HHS or CalSTA or OPR or our Environmental Protection Agency, once a month we all gather and talk, Jennifer, about this really specific issue around intersectionality and integrating climate into everything the state is funding and programming and regulating. And so, I hope to be able to partner with all of you as we move forward, and the climate cabinet moves forward towards delivering that intersectional and equitable approach to tackling climate.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you, Lauren. I think we might come back to you for some specifics around some of that, particularly ways that nonprofits could plug directly in to be helpful. But you said a couple things that segue very well to the question that I had for Veronica. Veronica, welcome, and thanks for being here. How, given your experience with communities, how has California's dependence on fossil fuels and other polluting industries affected the people in the communities that Leadership Council works with? And what state climate policies and investments do you think are most critical for California's vulnerable communities? And then are there some that we're making that you think are problematic?
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, everyone. As Lauren mentioned, thank you for having me today. I'm also here to learn from my fellow panelists and folks who are participating today. I want to start by taking a bit of a step back. So, Jennifer, you ran through a whole slew of slides around the impacts of climate change. Lauren, you talked about the state and your role within the state and the importance of intersectionality and addressing these issues holistically. And I kind of want to sort of take a step back and humanize what this means on the ground. So for context, my organization works in the San Joaquin Valley and the Eastern Coachella Valley, two sort of critical regions to the rest of California, but definitely to the rest of the country and the world, is big agricultural economies. And so when we talk about climate change and resilience and extreme heat and mitigation and adaptation, these are words that we're using in the policy context and, in global conversations. It's just happened a couple of weeks ago. But what it comes down to in reality is someone like Daniel in Merced County, who after 2 years of not being able to see family because of COVID and not being able to travel because of COVID, has finally decided to bring a close group of friends and families together for an outdoor dinner in their backyard and be able to bring together, only to realize that outdoor dinner is not possible because of stench and flies in their backyard are so strong because the dairy down the road just went from 5,000 cows to 10,000 cows in the name of climate. And what I mean by that is, some of California's policies are sort of further perpetuating inequity and racial injustice in communities, that dairies are now being incentivized to produce biomethane to create a transportation fuel, pumping it back into our natural gas pipelines, therefore furthering our reliance. And meanwhile, Daniel is being robbed of his dignity and humanity and resiliency and not being able to hold his family over for dinner because would any of you sit outside in your backyard with stench and flies? It's Natalia in Tombstone Territory, who at 5 years old had to explain to her neighbors and friends that there's no water coming from her tap. And so she can't shower, she can't bathe in her home. Meanwhile, thousands of acres of almonds are being planted in and around their neighborhood, thereby sort of creating a race to the ground. It sort of context that's sucking up all of our groundwater and concentrating contamination. It's someone like Pedro in Oasis in the Eastern Coachella Valley who lives in a mobile home park that's not weatherized, it's not insulated. And when it's 120 degrees outside, it's like being in a metal box. And you're now forced to sleep in your car with the AC running to give your kids some sort of relief. And so I think that when we're talking about what is climate change and what are the realities of climate change and how are we responding through local, regional, and statewide policy, I think we often forget about what are the realities on the ground and who's in the room when policies are being negotiated, when policies are being discussed, who holds power over whom, who are we being responsive to? I think that these are really important questions. And so for our work, as I'm glad to hear that there's Lauren, that you're chairing this cabinet level conversation around it, because we have found that there's such a disconnect between local, regional, and statewide coordination and alignment around climate. And I think when we, as we're working with community residents to advocate for climate justice policies that address racial injustice and racial inequities and income inequalities and housing, all of these issues, that we shouldn't have to fight so hard. This last year has been rough, and many of us watched and especially in the regions where we work and where I live and grew up, lost a lot of family and friends, unnecessarily lost family and friends because of lack of public health infrastructure, because unwillingness from just local decision makers to mobilize mobile clinics and in rural communities. Having to watch family and friends not be able to mourn the loss of a loved one is something that, you know, taught us a lot. It's something that's horrible and nobody should ever have to go through, but the pandemic sort of, for a lot of people, finally, in many, and racial reckoning that Lauren mentioned reference to earlier, sort of allowed others to start seeing what's happening to communities, and especially what's happening to Black and brown neighborhoods and communities across California and across the country. So you know, in short, I think that you know, we need to humanize and make sure we're in developing policy and in moving efforts forward, that we're not sort of robbing people of their resilience, their strength, and their dignity. And that when we're talking about climate change, we're thinking about and crafting policies and programs and investment practices, that we're thinking about people like Daniel, young ones like Natalia, people like Pedro and his son, you know, like that's just the reality of what we're experiencing. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. And I second Jan's comment in the chat. Thank you for painting such vivid pictures and telling us about those Californians. I want to ask you one more follow-up question before moving on, because I think that I look at the diversity of nonprofits that have joined us today. I know a lot of nonprofits would like to find ways to meaningfully engage in pursuing environmental justice, even if that's not like their primary mission. They understand and appreciate and want to be good partners, actors, allies, et cetera. Do you have a couple of tips for nonprofits who want to do that meaningfully, to reach out to organizations like yours in ways that don't, you know, burden you or tax your capacity, but that lift you up? How can folks do that?
Yeah, I'll start by saying that, as you noted, opening the panel, is that everything is a climate issue. Like, you know, for a while when I first started doing this work, we were trying to bring together people around transportation and implementation of a law in California called SB 375, which requires the integration of land use and transportation planning for the first time. And I talked to a lot of partners and they're like, we don't do transportation, like, don't invite us to these meetings. Like, this is not what we work on. But at the same time, they were working to make sure kids could get safely to school. They were trying to get a stop sign at the corner, you know, of an intersection. They were, you know, and I was like, this is transportation. So I guess I would say in the same way, is getting to know sort of where there are a lot of coalitions in the Valley and groups and networks and across the state that are doing really good work. And I think connecting with organizations that are doing some of that work is a great first step, or even becoming engaged. Like, even if you think that something that you're working on is not a climate issue, I know that we may talk about this later, but like how we respond even as organizations is a climate issue. So I think starting there, getting to know what is happening in your local community, how local decision makers are reacting to and responding to opportunities that allow us. I think that's a couple ways. Sort of reach out to groups, engage your neighbors, show up at local sort of agencies, and start understanding what is happening in our own communities.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Veronica. And thank you for all your good work. Shamus, let's turn to you for a second. What do you see in your work as a housing advocate as the aggravating factors that climate change is having on an already extraordinarily challenging space when it comes to the stock and availability of safe, affordable housing for the most vulnerable Californians? Like, and I guess maybe as a follow-up to that, maybe you can weave in how you see the effects of climate change on housing having kind of ancillary impacts on related services that nonprofits provide, whether it's food access or mental health services, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Veronica was talking, right, there were, so many other related things around, I think her work overlaps in this area as well, that there's so much of what's going on in climate. When I was prepping for this, I just started like writing a list, and the list just kept getting longer and longer in the way in which the housing crisis is overlapping with the climate crisis. I mean, I think it's, Veronica was talking about water, right? It's like, you can't build housing, you can't build new housing if you don't have access to water. You can't really legally live in a house that doesn't have access to water if you've lost it. And so you're seeing places across the state in which there's no longer water access because groundwater is either contaminated or it's just, you can't pump it anymore, right? You can't drill a well that's deep enough. And if you don't have access to, a sewer system and municipal water, you can't build there. Fire danger continues to be, a huge issue. And, fire is making us lose housing stock that we already have, but it's playing over into insurance. I mean, there are zip codes all throughout California now where you can't get private insurance, right? All you can do is tap into the state program to get access to fire insurance, and that's most likely not going to cover the full cost of your house if you're doing that. So it's changing the patterns of where we develop housing overall. And part of that is that we've been sort of sprawling in a way which puts more and more housing within the sphere of fire danger overall. You're also seeing this in utility costs, right? So your utility costs are directly tied to your housing, but as the utility costs go up and the changes around utilities are impacting the sector as well. So I think you see changes to building code, you see fire hardening, you see increasing in energy efficiency is really changing what it means to build housing and, and some of the ways in which the sector is changing overall. You see that the cost of wood is going up and is probably going to continue to go up because of, you have beetle damage, you have increasing fires that are challenging not just the wood stock that we have in California, but up into British Columbia and in different parts of Canada, where much of our wood stock comes from overall. And I think also on the demand side, as we start to think about who lives in California, the climate change is changing both patterns of immigration and migration. And that as we see people in Central America who are suffering, from their own challenges, we're going to increasingly see immigration from Central America in places where the farming is no longer viable, where climate change is destabilizing economies and also governments as well. And those things are already happening in California, but I think will increase as climate change becomes a greater and greater issue. And so when I think about kind of what's going on, I think about Paradise, right? And the campfire in Paradise, right? You had a community of 26,000 people, many of whom were living in Paradise because it was an affordable place to be, right? They didn't really have anywhere else to go. Paradise was that place in which they ended up. And you have the campfire, which was, really made much worse by climate change coming in and destroying people's lives. But I think not just what happened sort of in that moment, but then you think about the rollover into Chico. Many of those people moved down into Chico, and you had, increased housing costs within Chico as the vacancy rate dropped below 1% within Chico. You about a third of the homeless population in Chico right now are people who were displaced by the campfires. And then what you have because of increased homelessness in Chico and some other dynamics, you had a very reactionary city council come in Chico that tried to demonize people who had been displaced by the campfire and demonize people that were homeless, right? So you have this potential for climate change and its related impacts to drive sort of reactionary political swings in government as well. And so the way in which all these things are deeply connected, right, with what we have is a housing crisis overall, a need to build more housing in California and a need to invest in that, but also in which climate change is one, making that worse, and also really should be driving how we think about investments in housing into the future and building in ways that are going to help us deal with climate change, that are going to help us not exacerbate that climate change overall and tap into existing transportation systems and ways of living. And so, it's like the more I thought about it, like I'm working on this and working with Veronica for, I don't know, maybe 10 years on these sets of issues. But I was still kind of amazed once I thought about it, how deeply embedded climate policy is becoming in the work that I do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I thought I'd just invite everyone participating right now to just take a deep inhale and exhale, because this is very overwhelming, and we're right around the corner from talking about solutions and things that we can do. I want to talk with Catrice though before we get there, but I feel a personal need for taking a breath, so I'm inviting you all to join me. All right, and thankfully, many of us hopefully are able to take a clean air breath. We're fortunate to do that. Catrice, hi. Thanks for joining us. And I'm cheating a little bit because you and I work together on this, but I'm hoping that you will tell folks about how museums in California are both contending with climate change. You know, folks might not realize that we've lost several important cultural institutions in some of the recent wildfires, that some institutions provide free access during extreme heat events. How are museums taking steps to protect important cultural assets from loss, serving as these important civic refuges, and educating Californians through your programs and exhibits? And more broadly, how do you see the arts and culture sector's role in this existential crisis, and how that sector can partner with local and state government?
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. It's definitely a mouthful of a question, and I'm honored to be here with this great panel with all of the information that's being shared. So as you mentioned earlier in your intro, museums are very trusted institutions, particularly in this era of misinformation. People in America consider museums the most trustworthy source of information, and they're routinely rated higher than local newspapers, the government, and academic researchers. So as institutions, we value this trust that people place in us. And as an industry, we're committed to providing factual information that is, number one, entertaining, engaging, and inspirational. So when we're dealing with our shared existential crises, as you mentioned, museums provide trusted information that hopefully our audiences can use to make informed decisions. We're speaking specifically of climate change impacts today, but as everyone, Lauren, Veronica, Shamus, and you have all mentioned, it's very intersectional. And for many museums and professionals in our industry, this sentiment includes the pandemic and all of its impacts, as well as the breadth of social injustices that persist in all of our communities. And museums are definitely civic structures, as you say, and we can serve a space for public dialogue about improving our client resiliency. So earlier this year, for example, the San Diego Natural History Museum opened California Blooming, which is a photographic exhibition that explores wildflowers and climate change in our state. It presents California's extraordinary wildflowers as both a cause for celebration and a need for protection by connecting the biodiversity of our state with the actions that must be taken to protect it for ourselves and for the future. In conjunction with this exhibition, we also partnered with a local nonprofit organization, the Climate Science Alliance, to offer a series of lessons for both youth and adults about the impacts of climate change in Southern California. As for our actual institutions, like our buildings, we're managing climate change. We don't have to look very far to see how extreme temperatures, droughts, fires, flooding, mudslides, sea level changes, and everything else you mentioned in your opening slides negatively impacts our physical museums and the collections that we hold, which for most of us is California's history. Just a few months ago, as we sort of were referencing earlier, the Greenville's Cy Hall Memorial Museum was destroyed in the Dixie Fire. And just a few years ago, the Gold Nugget Museum was consumed in the Camp Fire. And because of this sort of like constant fire reality that we have, anti-fire engineering is a concept that we must all be concerned with. And so the Getty Museum is an example of the protections that can be gained when you have access to billions of dollars. Their buildings are clad in stone and steel, and their roofs are covered in stone to keep burning embers from igniting the structures from the outside. Their galleries are double walled and compartmentalized to prevent interior fire spreading if that were to happen. However, most other institutions do not have access to similar systems. So we really must look to our local and state government policies and actions to minimize the risks of these impacts of these type of threats at a community, city, county, and statewide level. And separate from the ever-present fire risk that we all have throughout the state, what many of the 1,500 museums in California are dealing with on a more regular basis is the impact of extreme temperatures, both on the people in our communities and for the optimal care of our irreplaceable collections. Even as Veronica was mentioning about the extreme heat in Central California, Southern California and San Diego here, a lot of places were never built with central air or heating. And because we did not have, such temperature extremes to deal with on such a regular basis. And so museums as civic structures provide these places, space, physical spaces similar to libraries, or, we don't have very many indoor shopping malls, but other large structures that can provide the access to cooling centers when we are reaching these nearly daily basis record high temperatures in Southern California. So at my Natural History Museum, we also have to very closely monitor humidity and light levels to see when they're getting out of balance to impact the sensitive materials that we hold, which is, again, another concern that was less of a concern even 20 years ago than it is now, where you have to sort of monitor not only the actual temperatures, but the ways the temperatures spike during the day and spike from week to week, as we've had here for the past few weeks. Many museums in California have been doing this for the past several years. So viewing museums as partners in serving their community needs is this other way that local and state government can partner with museums and the adjacent community serving nonprofit organizations as we all need to build our climate resiliency.
Wow, Catrice, thank you. Thank you for describing those kind of like all these different ways that institutions like yours are both, contending with the challenges, facing the challenges, communicating those challenges, and providing kind of refuge. You really wear a lot of hats in this space that maybe even people hadn't thought of any of those, with connection about museums and climate change before today. So thank you for describing all of that. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and get a little local for each of you. And I'm throwing this open to the whole panel. Whoever would like to go first, jump in. How do you see climate change impacts affecting your actual organization? Catrice, you just described some for museums, but maybe Veronica and Shamus, you could speak to your organizations or others you're familiar with, but risks like sea level rise or wildfires that are threatening nonprofits and their employees and communities, the ones located in the coast or in fire-prone areas. Shamus, you mentioned the insurance issue, but how are you contending with these things, or you're anticipating those, and what are you doing about them?
Well, there's a couple of things that we've done, that I think explain sort of how we have to shift as an organization. One of which is that we've worked a lot on, one of the challenges about thinking about housing and energy efficiency is, if you're a renter, right, your landlord doesn't have as much incentive to think about energy efficiency because your renter is the one paying the utilities usually, right? So any energy efficiency money you put into a unit is going to only benefit the tenant and not going to benefit the owner, right? And if you're the tenant, you can't really have control over those upgrades in a lot of ways, even if you're going to benefit from them. So there are all these sort of challenges around that playing out. And also, we do a lot of work around utility allowances and ways to make sure that especially low-income tenants benefit from solar upgrades and federal programs and state programs around those issues, because oftentimes the benefit will either all go to a tenant or all go to an owner, and those dynamics don't play out well for the parties involved. So we spend a lot of time thinking about that. The other thing is that I just hired somebody who's an expert on disaster-related issues, right? Because that's a huge part of our work now, is thinking about, we're a national organization focused on tenants' rights, but we're based in California as our home. So fire dangers, increase of hurricanes, increase of tornadoes in the Midwest, like all these compounding issues and how they affect tenants and federally assisted housing programs. It's just, we just had to have somebody in to work on those issues because it's starting to play out throughout the organization.
Yeah. Interesting. Veronica, I think you have an answer to a slightly different question that I wanted to pose too, which is kind of a other side of the equation in terms of not just challenges facing your organization and contending with it, but choices that you're making as an organization to reduce the climate impacts that your organization has. Like examples would be purchasing electric vehicles and other non-gas equipment and infrastructure, making those energy efficiency improvements to your own facilities, considering solar or other backup power, mean reconsidering permanent kind of remote work or providing public transportation incentives to your employees, less travel, reducing food waste, reducing your single-use plastic or your meat and dairy purchases. Like, what are any of your organizations kind of institutionalizing and owning kind of your own contribution, your own carbon footprint, and changing some of your own practices to chip in?
Yeah, we were fortunate enough in the last year and a half to secure enough resources to buy a building in downtown Fresno, an area that is rapidly changing, rapidly displacing existing residents and businesses, small businesses from an area that the city of Fresno, for just context, the city of Fresno is the 5th largest city in California, and a lot of people forget that. It's not as rural as we like to think it is, in purchasing the building, considerations that went in that we took were, close proximity to public transit, a walkable area and neighborhood where we can connect with residents, but also our team and colleagues can walk to get food, can walk, get exercise. It's close to Arte Americas, a local event in Fresno. And then as we're working to remodel the building, because there's some work to be done, is all energy efficient. We're looking at installing solar, we're looking at weatherizing the building. We're upgrading from asphalt to cool pavement. And nonprofits forget that we too are eligible for incentives like electric charging stations from the Air District or the Air Resources Board. So we too can apply for those resources and make sure that we are accessing them. So we're working with the local air district and others to make sure that we can put electric charging stations in our parking lot, make them publicly accessible. We don't own cars yet, but if we did, we would love to figure out, our geography is so big. So the San Joaquin Valley is huge. And so, our preference would be to be able to own electric vehicles that we can charge on site, that community residents and partners can use. So I think those are a couple of ways on the sort of more human, for our teams, we are considering sort of permanent remote work policies moving forward that allow people to stay at home a couple days a week. We are very careful about when we're planning outreach activities and door to door, so that we're not out in communities or asking community residents to be outdoors during excessive heat waves or when wildfires are raging in, Sequoia National Park. So those are some things that we are doing to try and also reduce our footprint and make sure that, we're walking the talk too.
Anyone else? And Laura, and feel free to chime in on what the state government might be doing around this in terms of choices too.
The state government owns and operates over 1,700 facilities up and down the state, and our Department of General Services, DGS, has an ambitious sustainability roadmap that I think they just updated for 2020, but it lays out kind of sector by sector everything our state government is trying to do, very much in the ethos of kind of lead by example, and the public sector should be investing heavily in, especially technologies where they're more expensive, to help bring down the cost for nonprofits and communities across the state. So everything from putting in ZEV chargers, as Veronica mentioned, and making sure that transit buses that state employees are using are zero emission, to procuring cleaner energy. We have 2 community solar agreements across the state, and then a lot on water efficiency and conservation, so that we make sure that the state's workforce is walking the walk on the water conservation agenda as well. And Jennifer, maybe Christine could bring up the slide on California's climate investments just quickly, because Veronica teed this up really well. House Gas Reduction Fund appropriated, together with the legislature, over $15 billion into different incentive programs. And as Veronica mentioned, nonprofits are eligible for the vast majority of these. And the governor, together with the legislature earlier this summer, appropriated an additional $15 billion to a climate resilience package. And I can drop in kind of our Department of Finance details on this. But if you look at the kind of projects that we're funding and incentives that the state is giving out, it's so much broader than just energy and vehicles. You look at affordable housing units from our AHSC program, urban trees from urban greening and urban forestry, And there are, I think, over 60 different programs to apply for different incentive funding for, very much in the ethos of, traditionally, I think a lot of opting into the green solutions have been more expensive because of the long history of subsidizing fossil fuels in the state and across the country. So really excited to kind of continue to offer these incentives to nonprofits and communities and school districts and air districts across the state. And then also you'll notice in the top left, historically over half of this funding has benefited our disadvantaged communities and low-income Californians across the state. I would love for that to be even higher in future years. So a lot here to apply for and be in touch with state government folks on to clean operations up across the state.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. And I into the chat a link to the grants.ca.gov, the California State Grants Portal, which has a lot of those opportunities. But Lauren, I got a takeaway while you were talking that maybe we should collaborate, CalNonprofits and you, on creating some kind of very specific, set of grant programs that are available, so folks don't all have to find those independently. But maybe we could work together on a suite of those to make sure nonprofits know what they would be eligible for as they look to make these kinds of investments in their properties, et cetera.
I love that, Jennifer. We just quickly, in that same vein, we've kind of thought about a Common App application. For those of you familiar with the Transformative Climate Communities program in California, how could we make it easier for a nonprofit or a school district or a community to essentially fill out a Common App like you do for college? And then the state could say, here are the 20 different grant programs that you're eligible for, and one link instead of 20 different agencies.
Oh my gosh.
Government being better government.
Amazing thing.
That would be real, like, responsive government right there. It'd be fantastic and easier on everyone. Thank you for that. Let me, we've got about 9 more minutes before we're gonna move into answering some of the questions, and I'm seeing those are some great questions, so I wanna save time for those. But quickly on the resources side, Catrice, you're probably the best suited to speak to this, although Veronica and Shamus as EDs, you're in the fund development space also. But how are you telling your story differently to appeal to funders, whether it's philanthropy, individual donors, or government, to support changes that you need to make in the way you run your organization, those expansion of services that you may need to provide to prepare or respond to increasing disasters, or to just meet more need that will be prompted by this? And are your funders responding with a willingness to support your climate readiness or response?
Yes, so I would say that San Diego Natural History Museum has a slight advantage because we are an active scientific research institution. So our researchers have been studying climate change, essentially like the climate and the flora and fauna and change over time for 150 years. And so we have this data that we share with local policymakers for land use and land management needs. And so we have this kind of like repository of information that we're already known as a trusted source to provide. So we've been sort of shifting the messaging to say, like, okay, we have this information, we have these resources, we have, all of this documented data of California's history. We need to be able to protect this for the future and beyond. So we've been kind of pairing that message of the importance of the science behind climate change with the importance of having this data and these collections available for the next generation. And so kind of making that case for our facility in that regard. The great thing is that we have been having success with both private and government funders in this regard as we talk about some of the very real needs. Even I don't say the basics, but the basics like light bulbs. As we were just talking about, there over the past several years, we've replaced thousands of light bulbs in the museum, which seems like a small, easy project, but it's one of the things that we were definitely trying to do to want to reduce our energy usage, but also to have more responsible lighting within the museum. And what that means for us was replacing light bulbs within the galleries and the collection spaces and the office spaces over several years with many donor funding support. And along with that, upgrading our HVAC systems so that we have systems that are more responsive to the spikes in temperature and that could handle the heat loads better than the systems that we'd had installed 4 years ago when we first were starting to have the air conditioning needs in the building. And so just the funding for these projects seems sort of nuts and bolts for many people, but as Lauren was saying, the state government has funding available for these projects because they are not inexpensive. And for many of these projects, there's also documenting the need of why you need to do it, which are their own types of studies, which again are just cost associated, which a lot of nonprofits just do not have readily available funding to pursue. And so again, a lot of it I think is making this sort of case in all of our regards that every nonprofit is a climate nonprofit, like that we all have to make this investment so that we can see these long-term changes that we need to reduce the rate at which the temperatures are rising.
Thank you. Thank you. Veronica or Shamus, anything to add on that funds? Okay. All right. Well, this is the last question, and I saved the best for last. And sorry, Lauren, hot seat for you. We're going to do a slightly speed round so we can get to other Q&As. But here's the question, everyone. Pretend that someone from the governor's office who advises him on climate change was on this call. What would you say is the one thing that Governor Newsom could propose by way of policy, investment, or partnership that would most meaningfully address the most disconcerting and disruptive aspect of climate change on the work that your organization does or the needs your community has? And Lauren, I see you have your pen in your hand. Who would like to go first?
I can continue and go first and then leave it to Veronica and Shamus from there. So this is kind of wearing my CAM, my California Association of Museums hat, but what we've been proposing and advocating for the past several years is funding to decarbonize California museums and protect collections. As we've been talking about today, funding to promote climate resiliency through museums programs for our most needing communities throughout the state, and funding to inspire innovation in sustainable museum design. We can all be like the Getty. So climate change impacts all aspects of life and society for museums, zoos, aquariums, cultural sites, gardens, and as physical spaces, there's, as I said, more than 1,500 museums, and we have a very tangible role that we can play in supporting the state government. So we want the government to leverage us as civic and public institutions that can promote climate resiliency and protect vulnerable cultural collections and structures from the impacts of our constantly warming planet.
Thank you, Catrice. And we learned yesterday, Lauren, everyone here got to learn about the $31 extra billion that are anticipated. So museums. Veronica, Shamus?
I'm happy to go next, but this is a hard question because I have suggestions on a lot of things, but I'll go with one where the governor has already started some work here that I think is really important to a lot of communities. And Lauren, you mentioned it in your opening remarks when Governor Newsom was in Wilmington not too long ago to announce a 3,200 foot setback rule. And I would join allies in urging the governor to defend that rule, to prohibit redrilling of wells within the 3,200 setback distance rule, and to ban on-new permits until that rule is in place, which we know will take a long time. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Shamus?
Well, I don't know, I can't help but be super ambitious, which is that I think that the entire way in which we think about where we're going to build new housing is fundamentally flawed in California, and that's so undermining housing affordability across the spectrum in California, and also undermining our climate change goals, right? And so right now what we do is we have all these local governments that are deciding on their own, and we've tweaked a lot of things at the state level to try to increase housing and housing affordability, but at a basic level, we're still working at a neighborhood by neighborhood level, trying to decide where we're building housing, and still have real strong incentives to sprawl out as opposed to build in cities, that we're not adequately taking into account the lived experience of people on the ground, that we're still forcing a lot of development just into communities that are willing to accept it or have little political power, and not taking on sort of some of the, the richest and the whitest communities to make sure that they build housing as well. And all those things I think are deeply connected with why we have the housing crisis that we have and why we have the climate crisis, as well. Like we have to rethink how we live and where we live within our communities. And so, there's mine. And I think the one other plug I would make, which is that I think that CEQA and California's main environmental law needs to be reformed because, the way in which it interacts with the housing market and is used as a tool for NIMBYism has to change as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And I am a lobbyist, so I will not throw away my shot here either. But rather than love one of my babies more than others, Lauren, I would just make a broad appeal for finding a path, sort of what Veronica talked about earlier, of making sure when big decisions get made about big investments that nonprofits are in the room, that communities are in the room, that we're not like noticed afterwards and encouraged to clap, but instead we are actually centered in those conversations. And there are a lot of well-meaning, smart, fantastic people in California, but no one corners the market on the good ideas and what we know what communities need. The people who know that best are the communities. So I just would make that broad request for making sure when the governor's budget comes out in January that we all see ourselves in it and we see the ideas that have bubbled up from the most vulnerable Californians, rather than, the best idea that someone from Silicon Valley had. Okay, I said that. Next, I want to move to the broader question.
Jennifer, no chance to, can I just get 30 seconds to respond?
Lauren, yes. If you just want to say yes to all that, we're all good.
I mean, I have to check with the boss, but I guess I couldn't agree with you. First off, thank you to all three of you for sharing such thoughtful reflections and suggestions and counsel that I can bring back to the governor. But Jennifer, just on your point, and I've shared this with you, but just for the broader group, I approach this job with so much humility. I have a very narrow policy expertise on an issue that, as we've talked about for the last hour, is so wide ranging, ever impacting Californians, ever evolving. Folks have heard the governor talk about kind of the accelerating science and the accelerating impacts, but I think luckily working together with nonprofits and with communities, our solutions are accelerating so quickly as well. And so in the context of kind of policymaking and making sure that our climate agenda doesn't perpetuate systemic racism and existing health and social and economic disparities across California, I start with the questions, what problem am I trying to solve and for whom? And when, I think, Veronica, you put this really well, when you look around the decision-making table, who's at the table and whose voice am I not listening to? And in too many instances in state government, there are people that aren't at the table. And so a critical role that you all play is helping those voices be heard. In the context of the budget, Jennifer, as you know, we get an influx of budget letters. I can promise you every single one of those is read and reviewed by our team and trying to craft, a governor's budget that all of our stakeholders can see themselves in and all of our communities feel lifted up and seen by the governor. So I would just, a call to action from the governor's office to you all to please continue that engagement and to help us craft the most equitable and community-centered agenda going forward.
Thank you for that. Can I get tactical about that? Like, for reals, you guys are building a budget right now. For reals, there is additional surplus funding going into next year. If someone on this call has an idea that they think is important for your consideration, exactly how would they communicate that to your team?
I am incredibly open about my email, so I'm just going to drop it in the chat. Please send me an email. Shamus, as you probably know, we have a whole kind of housing team. We're doing a lot of thinking on climate and housing and the intersection there. And so, if you aren't in touch with those folks, I'd love you to put you in touch directly. Veronica, we work closely with you and friends, and Catrice, I am remembering your letter on museums from last year and would love to follow up on kind of specific budget proposals. But for everyone else on the call, please reach out. Again, humility first and foremost in this job. I can't do it without the actual expertise that all of you bring to the state and to the Capitol.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lauren. Let me move just in the last few minutes that we have. I'm scrolling these questions. Thank you, Lucy, for making sure I can see them. I'm looking at some of them, and I will try to take them in. Okay, Lauren. What advice would you give the nonprofit sector about accessing increased funding Actually, never mind. You just gave us that. A parallel, do you think that the infrastructure bill that just passed creates additional kind of funding opportunities?
Yeah, what an exciting day. It's infrastructure week actually in Washington, and I'd be going off my talking points if I didn't point out that we're also waiting to see the fate of Build Back Better, which includes a lot of the climate investments I think Californians really need. Our Department of Finance team has a whole federal unit that right now is poring over the 1,000-page infrastructure bill and looking at the specific pots of funding. If state government's confusing, federal government, as someone who used to work for them, is even more confusing and even less coordinated, I would say, with affection. For example, there is several hundreds of millions of dollars in EV charging coming to the state that right now CalSTA is competing for. But infrastructure is done at CEC, et cetera, et cetera. So we are very much kind of tiering out the pots of funding that are available for our agencies to apply for, and then hopefully put into our buckets of programs that I mentioned earlier that nonprofits, communities, school districts, hospitals, et cetera, are very welcome to apply for. So I hope we have a lot more clarity around that in the context early in the new year, and can share with everyone that the Californian agencies will very much apply for and compete for any federal dollars that are on the table.
Great. Well, we would love to stay in touch with that, as CalNonprofits has an extensive, mailing list and membership, and we would love to keep, create opportunities to communicate out what of those new opportunities and existing ones, like I said, might be valuable to our nonprofits. Let me ask a broader question, and this is open to any of you. What encouragement would you give to young people who are facing this future, trying to advocate for and do the work to make their communities more resilient and feeling discouraged by the enormity of it and the perceived apathy? Veronica, do you have some thoughts?
Don't sell yourself short. I think, as I would still consider myself as being young. So I think it's, recently I was in a conversation where there was a lot of talk about how do we get to ambitious climate policy in California. And the talk was completely centered around brokering deals between the labor movement and the environmental movement, and who are the players and who are the senior leaders who are in those two worlds that need to come together and cut a deal and put it before the governor and get the governor's support. And I think that conversation totally missed the mark and undermined the strength of community power and the strength of youth voices in California who are starting to engage in their own way, in creative and innovative ways to make their voices heard. And I think that often we find ourselves in rooms and in situations where we think we're not competent enough or experienced enough or knowledgeable enough. And the reality is that we tend to sell ourselves short. And then because of being intimidated in that space, and because the magnitude of the issues are so intense, and you're led to believe that you need to come up with complex policy solutions and transactions and figure out a program that can go from CEC to the CTC to HCD, it feels like it, but anyway, so it feels overwhelming. And I would say that it really isn't. And it really is incumbent upon all of us to make common sense out of our systems of governance. And I think that starts by making sure that we all in this movement, the nonprofit sector, government, private, that we are more inclusive of community voices, and not being so quick to say, well, you're not the mover and shaker. You don't know who the head of the building trades is, so you don't get a seat, because that's where power is negotiated. And I think that is a huge disservice to our youth and a huge problem to our community. So I would say, let's not undermine ourselves, and let's claim our seat at the table, and then pull up chairs for all of our friends, right? Just because you get a seat doesn't mean that's it. Pull up those chairs for everyone else. So that would be my advice to folks.
I would just tack on to that, if I can chime in for 1 second too, and just say, those of us with knowledge and power, relationships, and access ourselves, you're right. Our job is to make room for others. And I try to see my own advocacy as opening up a conversation and then allowing it to take place rather than speaking on behalf of others. I also think we need to do everything we can to demystify Sacramento and the public policy process. It's in the interest of a lobbying class to make Sacramento seem like a place where you need to have like special knowledge or special relationships. And it's our job, I think, to break that down at every turn that we can and be very clear that everyone can engage here. You do not need to be special or especially. And so like trainings and other things that we can do to help people understand how the process works and get their own direct access is an important part of this. And young people, I have never seen more effective advocates than young people. And the younger, the more effective in my experience. Catrice or Shamus?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, like, as we, talk about, and we're talking with Lauren and hearing kind of these statewide and, federal level changes, I think we also can't lose sight, particularly for young people, that there is so much to be done in your own, where you are as well. As I take even for example, our museum, San Diego Natural History Museum, we are hyperly focused on Southern California and the Baja California Peninsula. And it doesn't mean we're not changing the world, but the way that we're working to influence change is located where we are to change the experience of the people that we are living and working with. And I think for young people, it sometimes can feel very disempowering if you're like, I'm just a high school student or I'm just a middle school student. I don't even understand how the federal government or state government works, but you could be advocating with the principals of your school and working on city council or school council, like being on your whatever leadership positions you have or participating to sort of build those muscles of how you influence your peers and influence change. And I think that is something that we definitely shouldn't overlook, of work where you are and then kind of grow organically, grow purposefully, but don't feel like you can't affect change because you're not affecting state policy.
In the housing and working on housing issues, I think that so much of the change that we have seen is not because of advocates like me, it's because of organizing that's gone on and community organizing around housing issues. That what I get to do is work with those folks and tweak policy around the needs and the organizing, the power building that's gone on. But most of the stuff that I work on, I'd never be able to accomplish. And I'm not actually accomplishing, right? What I am is tweaking a power that's already there. And I think so much of that is within the climate movement as well, which is that there are people with technical expertise, but the political change that's required is really being driven by organizing around these sets of issues. The other thing I think about too with climate is like, people are going to take radical action around climate. The question really is at what point and to whose benefit, right? That's what we're working on. Like, this is changing, but the question is, can we change it quickly enough? And who bears burdens, who bears benefits as part of that change? And so thinking about it from that standpoint, it's not about like, it's about shaping that change that's coming down the road for all of us and not sort of making change happen in some ways.
Jennifer, I would just add two quick things. I was in Scotland 2 weeks ago for the UN climate conference you opened with, and for those of you that have been to a COP, walked around the kind of conference venue, which feels like a massive air hangar with no humanity and thousands of diplomats kind of all running around. 95% of global energy and climate ministers are men. And I have to say the generational gap between the folks kind of hammering out the agreements and mostly protecting capitalism and big oil versus the youth strikes in the streets on the Friday and Saturday that I was there, and just the energy and the urgency. And what I feel from the youth is a sense of just commitment to do whatever we can because their future is on the line. The most productive or the most energizing and motivating meeting I had while in Glasgow was with a young woman, Alexandria Villaseñor, who's 16 and is from Davis, and took 2 weeks off of high school to fly to Scotland because she's been mobilizing grassroots youth across California and the global Fridays for Future movement with Greta. And, had to take 2 weeks off of her already stressful high school career fly to Scotland and mobilize with all of these youth and to push national leaders and to push us as state leaders. So I have an unbelievable amount of admiration for our youth. And like Veronica, kind of count myself that. I think a lot of people question why the governor appointed a 32-year-old climate advisor when everyone else in the climate cabinet I mentioned earlier, I think is 20 years older than me. But it's that sense of urgency and commitment and really feeling like, and you know, I think about this daily. I'm afraid to have kids. I worry about my future, and I worry about community's future and our youth's actual future in this state. And then secondly, would just say along the lines of having a 32-year-old climate advisor for the state, representation matters, and our youth, and specifically our young women of color, being able to see themselves in government, in positions of power, in decision-making roles is incredibly important for the success of this movement moving forward, and just diversifying opinions, solutions, perspectives, and is something, you know, everyone has my email address now. So if you have phenomenal folks that you think should be lifted up by state government, please also send those along as well.
Yeah, and I suppose that's also a good opportunity just to mention that the governor has many appointments at his disposal, right? As the leader of the executive branch of government, has a whole appointments unit on the governor's website. Maybe somebody can drop gov.ca.gov into the website that you can look at a drop-down menu of all the available appointments for commissions or for full-time positions. But there's a lot of opportunity, I think there, and as Lauren's just described, they're looking to make sure they fill those in a way that's representative of California, and as you can see, a senior climate advisor at the ripe old age of 32, everyone can count on getting considered, I think, if they meaningfully apply for some of those leadership positions. So I don't want to detract from Catrice's fabulous idea that we can there are lots of opportunities locally, but I just want depending on who you are and where you are, even the governor of California has myriad kind of opportunities to plug you and your voice in to decisions being made about climate and a whole host of other issues. So I see a few other questions, but they're so specific, and I feel like we have landed in a broader general place. I guess I'd like just to create an open space for the remaining couple minutes for our panelists. If there's anything you feel that you wanted to say today but hasn't come out, or recognizing we still have 83 folks on, I can see from the California nonprofit sector. Is there anything on this topic that you'd just like to close with before we finish up today? Oh my gosh, what a successful conversation. Veronica?
I'm just going to say that we talked a lot about all the bad, and we can do this. Like, we can respond in time for our generation and future generations, and it is possible. And sometimes we get in our own way because of politics, because of lack of leadership, because of unwillingness, because of racism, because of, putting profit over people, because of a number of issues. And I guess I would just like to end on a more positive note, that there are so many Californians, young and everyone along, who are willing to roll up their sleeves and do the work, and willing to commit. This isn't going to be easy, but it is possible. And so, that's something that we talk a lot about, and it's possible when we respect each other's expertise. This is the frame that we use at Leadership Council, which is co-powerment. I don't like to hear empowered, because as I was growing up, it was always like, Veronica, we have to empower you and empower you and empower you, as if I had nothing to bring. And so every time somebody told me that, I felt like they were taking bits and pieces away from me. So when we launched Leadership Council, it was very important for us to sort of launch with the frame of co-powerment and recognizing sort of lived experience, expertise, work, everything, and how together, when we're willing to do the work, we can, anything is possible. So I'll end with that. Thank you, Jennifer.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you for that. I'll also add that I think we often feel like there's this tension in this topic between like big systemic change that's absolutely going to be necessary, and put on the opposite sort of side of that all of our own personal choices, and treat it as if it's like an either or situation. And I think to do that does like potentially lead you down a like like kind of exasperated, anxious ridden state. And I find just in my own life that finding ways to do both, right? They both matter. And we are at a point where all of it has to be done. Like we don't get to choose between making different choices personally about what we eat, what we buy, how we move ourselves about the planet. Like what our infrastructure investments we like make in our own homes. Like we need to all be like doing that work, getting on the Google. There are plenty of resources for all of that. We need to be making those choices. And I find that most of the climate adapted tools, they're awesome. Like the future can be awesome. Like have you driven an electric car? They're super fun. Have you walked around on radiant floors? They're fantastic. Have you not been in a forced air, like heated space? That air is cleaner and easier to breathe and less filled with dust. And so I am optimistic too, that the future can be awesome and that it doesn't need to be just a story of sacrifice and ways that we're going to give up things. Like we really can make a better future for all of us. And we just need to roll up our sleeves and decide that our future matters. Our future planet and our children matter enough to make both those choices in our own lives, but also put our voices forward to make sure the biggest possible change happens on the moving those policy levers. So, Catrice or Shamus, anything before we pass it back to Jan? Well, thank you. I just want to thank you on behalf of all of you for joining us for this. I learned a lot. I think our panelists did. And Jan, thank you very much for focusing one of the precious few panels at our convention this year on this topic.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer. You were great.
Thank you.
And I just have to say thank you to all of you because, this is the most uplifting session on climate I've ever seen. Usually after a discussion about climate, you're ready to just go off and crawl into a corner and die, So, and part of it is just each one of you has such personal warmth and such personal optimism. I kind of feel like if I could put my hands on the screen and get your vibrations directly into me, that would be great. So thanks very much to all of you. Just a word about this afternoon session at 2 o'clock. It's our closing session, and it's a debate: should donor advised funds be regulated? Probably the most highly emotional debate that we have right now in our nonprofit community, and we're very excited to have a terrific group of people debating, and we'll poll everybody at the beginning and at the end to see how many people change their minds during that debate. And then lastly, I just want to also thank our off-camera staff today, Christine Metropolis, Henry Duong, Vanessa Cruz, Lauren Kay, and Lucy Salcido Carter, who will be our MC for this afternoon. And then finally, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't encourage you to become a member of CalNonprofits. And lots of you on the panel already are. I want to thank you for that as well. But the biggest portion of our budget comes from membership, and it really is true. We really depend on membership, and it makes a difference in our being able to be advocates and timely advocates as well. So thanks very much, everybody, and I will see you this afternoon. Oh, and as a bonus, after the debate, we have this really cool live jazz duo. So see you soon. See you at 2 o'clock. Bye.